Okay, so this session is meant to give us some ideas for what we want to start thinking about just as we're designing mini classes or mini sequences and preparing to teach. So this is outside of the element of looking specifically at our visual adjustments, our verbal adjustments, and physical adjustments, which you'll be doing more with Joanna. But we're looking at things to start to think about, how we want to teach, elements of a space and an audience that we need to consider before we're even creating a class. So this is just to inform you and to start to experiment a bit with how you're sequencing and who you are sequencing for. So I like to categorize it as sort of 4 different types of teaching or teaching styles. The first is just talking. So you might have seen this if you've been to a Bikram or Bikram-derived hot yoga series. You will see the teacher just talking. So they don't necessarily adjust, they don't necessarily demonstrate. It's just language, it's just verbal instructions that is guiding the class into their postures. If you've been in those classes, you might notice that sometimes people are confused and they need a little bit more indication of how to do something than just what verbal language will do. The second option is talking and demonstrating together. And this is probably what you're most common with, what you've seen maybe in more of the classes that you're taking yourself. Or for example, right now in this course, we are speaking and we are demonstrating at the same time. So that doesn't mean there's adjustments, physical adjustments, but visual and verbal adjustments are there. So any yoga class, you've probably experienced this, and you can balance how much you're talking with how much you're demonstrating depending on your audience and level of practice. The third group that I like to categorize is still mostly talking, but then adjusting. So the emphasis shifts a little bit away from demonstrating. You can still demonstrate as you need or when it's required, but you're mostly just talking, you're moving around in the space. So everyone, even if you're not physically touching them, they feel your presence. You can move, you can also observe people in different ways rather than just from the front of the room. If you move to the side or to the back, then you can see different students. And that allows you to give them more feedback personally, even if it's not physical touch. So if you're choosing to do more adjustments, then this is what you want to aim for. So just speaking, using your voice to get people in, and then adjusting more personal touch student to student. You will find that this isn't always possible if you're teaching more beginner students, or depending on language, if you're teaching in a language that is not native to most of your students, then this will become a little bit harder. And the last categorization that I have is just adjusting. So in something like Ashtanga, where you have Mysore style or Mysore practice, then you're learning a set series as a group of students or as a studio, and then you come and you self-practice, and the teacher, your role is just to adjust physically. So only physical adjustments, but this requires a certain level of practice or a certain commitment and dedication from your students. So you'll find for yourself, you'll have to find a balance of those things. And in the beginning, when you're teaching, as you're starting to learn now, you'll feel more comfortable with one thing over the other. So to do too many things will feel quite overwhelming at first. So in the beginning, you're probably just sticking with mostly talking, just working on that first, demonstrating, and then maybe getting off your mat and moving around the space a little bit. But that will take some time to do. So learning how to do those things and thinking about maybe for you, for example, you're someone that you need to do a pose in order to explain it. Or you might find that as you start teaching, you have to do that. So in the beginning, you might have to do every single shape in order to be able to explain it and to think about the instructions that you want to give. Slowly that will shift, and you can explore a little bit with the different styles or different types of teaching that we have. The other thing is it depends on what you connect with personally. So whether you are a visual learner, an auditory learner, or more tactile, you might prefer to be taught in a specific way, or that a way that connects with you a bit more, but then you might teach yourself in a different way than you learn, depending on your audience. So think about all of these things, all of these elements as you start to teach. see what feels a little easier for you, figure out the things that you need to work on, and then those will become integrated as tools, even if you don't always use them in your teaching. So a few other things to think about as you're organizing your classes. The biggest thing is obviously your audience. Who are you teaching? Who is going to be in front of you? More or less, what do you expect? So if you're teaching a private lesson, which we'll talk about later in this series, if you're teaching a private lesson, then you have a very good idea of exactly what's happening with your audience. If you're teaching, the other extreme of that would be teaching a big open level class where you don't know most of your students. So you don't have an awareness of maybe what their practice is or how long they've been practicing. Obviously, if you have regular students, that will be a little bit different, but you're teaching people where you might have a lot of different levels in one space. More or less, if you're teaching in a studio environment, your class will hopefully have a level or a style that gives you an indication that people are familiar with Ashtanga, or they're familiar with Shivananda, or they've been practicing in their level 2, level 3. So you have some things that hopefully filter people, but it will be a bit more challenging because this is when you have to use more of your variations, both for beginner students and for more advanced students. So in that mixed open level group is probably the hardest group of people to teach because you don't necessarily know who's showing up that day. So you have a plan in your mind. For example, let's say you're teaching an intermediate class. So even if a class is labeled on a schedule as intermediate, we'll be doing some arm balances, we're working into some very simple inversions, but then you show up for class and everyone basically is a beginner. So you have to be able to adapt to your audience that is there. If you want to work on some of those things, one or two of those things, or then just do the preparation for them, then you have to be able to transition and adapt your sequence in the moment. So it's going to take a little bit of being flexible within your sequence and realizing who is in front of you. So always, when you're planning, when you're starting to prepare, you will have a plan, definitely have a plan. Don't just show up and teach whatever you want. Have an idea in mind. You might be a more structured person, you might be a little more fluid, but have your plan, but know that it will change. So know that who is in front of you is who you are teaching. So take that into consideration. See if you teach something and 90% of your class really can't do it, or they're struggling to do it, or they look unsafe, then probably don't teach that, or don't teach poses that are more challenging than that for sure. Otherwise, it's just you when you're showing off for yourself as the teacher that, okay, I can do headstand, and then 95% of your class cannot. So it doesn't feel very good as a student, and it feels very defeating. So think about it. First thing, biggest thing is your audience. So know what level, if it's possible, what style, whether you've been given a specific style, make sure that you are comfortable to teach that style. And if you're not given a style, then see, for example, like if you're teaching in a gym environment and they're just saying yoga, see if you can get more of an idea of, okay, am I teaching people that are active in the gym and they've been active and they've been weightlifting and now they just want to relax? Or I'm teaching people that they're coming and they're active and they want a dynamic class. So try to get a sense of how active of a class, how passive of a class they want, which you will have to obviously change over time. Think about the time of day. So when you see people at 6 o'clock in the morning, what you teach them will be very different than what you teach them at 6 o'clock in the evening. So in the morning, most people do have more energy, so you can do more dynamic or heat building, but their flexibility will not be as much. So if you've just woken up and you've walked or driven to your yoga class, you're going to be stiff in the body. So you need to create more heat, you need to lubricate the joints a bit more, and that will influence your sequencing. Versus in the evening, if you teach a class at 6 in the evening, just remember people have been at work for 8-10 hours of their day, so they're mentally going to be exhausted and maybe even physically exhausted. So balancing that with maybe the body feels a little bit more open in the afternoon because you've been moving, the body temperature is up again, versus what is their energy level, how lethargic are they, how much stamina do they have at that time. So add that into what you're planning. And then age, if you know it, you might have an idea of a relative demographic. Obviously, if you're teaching in a gym that's mostly younger people, you have people in their 20s and 30s, that's going to be a different class than if you're teaching people over 60. So know those things, know gender. What I teach to a group of women only might be different than just a group of men, or if it's a pretty mixed class, then I want to balance the strength building and the flexibility. So if you only ask most men to only do flexibility-based things, they probably will not enjoy yoga. But if you add some strength building things that they're already probably a little bit better at or easier for them, then you have that balance and you move into that sense of yoga anyways. We want to balance those two elements in the body. So all of those things, think about your audience, think about the space that you'll be teaching in. If you're teaching in a yoga studio, do you have props? Obviously, we are learning how to use props, but know whether the space you have, do you have blocks, do you have straps? Where are all of these things? Do you have these tools to assist you when you're teaching? And then think about just the space in itself, the ambience of itself, how much control you have over that or not. Relative to a studio environment, if you're teaching for someone else, you might not have any control over that. So you have to know what's expected of you. Versus if you have control of the whole space, then think about where you want people facing. Not just yourself, but how do you want to set your students up? Do you want them facing each other head to head? Do you want them all facing in one direction? What's happening? What's going to be the easiest way for you to see people and for them to see you? So all of these things sort of outside of voice, outside of instructions, just start to take into consideration as you're planning your classes. Don't overthink them, but just allow them to influence your decision making and your sequencing and the class structure that you're starting to create.